So welcome if you're joining us for this session, wherever you're joining from. I'm really aware that so many of you be joining from different contexts, some of you from homes, some of you from student rooms, some of you from nuclear bunkers, like Roger looks a little bit like he might be in one of those this morning. But welcome. We're going to be spending some time chatting about the subject of student mental health, emotional well-being, and just the challenges of this season. So if you don't know me, my name's Dr Kate Middleton. I'm one of the directors of the Mind and Soul Foundation. So you can find us at mindandsoulfoundation.org. And we are a national organisation passionate about everything that it means to be emotionally well, to be flourishing in life, whether that's in normal everyday life when you've hit particular challenges, or in weird and totally unexpected moments like this one. But you'll be very grateful to know that it's not just me talking to myself in this session. So I have two amazing and inspiring people who I'm going to be spending some time chatting with this morning. I have Dr. Roger Bretherton and I have Rachel Gardner. So why don't you guys introduce yourselves, give a little potted explanation of who you are. Roger, why don't you start?
I would love to, Kate. Brilliant to be with you. Yeah, so I'm Roger Bretherton. I'm a clinical psychologist and a university lecturer. So I work at the University of Lincoln. And I guess you could say right now, I'm sort of immersed in the question of student well-being, really. So not only do I supervise the student well-being team at Lincoln, but also I evaluate lots of kind of interventions that try to improve student well-being. I'm sort of lecturing on that subject all the time, training and advising staff on how to look after students on campus. So as you can imagine, the last few months really been a very busy time for me. And I think the best way of putting it is the way I just put it, which is I constantly sit in that question of what do we do to help students function well psychologically. And I guess as time goes on, I have a sort of leaning towards saying, well, maybe the answer isn't so much about providing them with meals. You know, if it was malnutrition, handing out new interventions all over the place, but more about kind of teaching people to cook, in the sense that a lot of what I've been doing really is about how do we get really good psychological skills to students so they can learn them, develop them, and then when all the challenges and the difficulties of life come their way, they're ready to cope with it. So I suppose that's the sort of world I sit in, and you can imagine that that's been a very busy world over the last few months.
Fantastic, thank you. And I guess it's a good moment just to say, obviously Roger's up in Lincoln, I'm speaking from Hertfordshire. Rachel will share that she's in I want to say just in the north. That's not very specific. She'll be more specific in a minute. But we are aware that people will be watching this from all kinds of different locations. And as I've already said, different perspectives. And we'll bear that in mind. But it's complex, isn't it? People's situations are very different. So I love what you're saying, Roger, about some general tips and tricks that we can think about to help people thrive in this season. Rachel, share a bit from your perspective.
So I'm a wannabe doctor. I'm not a doctor. I'm Rachel Gardner. I would like to be Queen of the North, but I'm still a Southerner finding her feet in the Northwest. So I'm in Preston in the Northwest. And I have, my background is youth ministry. I spend most of my time thinking about how churches can engage really effectively with 11s to 18s. But since being part of a church plant in Preston that really is focused on students, I've been taking more of a responsibility in our church, developing our work among students, and have noticed they're very similar to young people. And I think that's what I've kind of been quite taken aback by, that actually the students that we are working with, who are just extraordinary in Preston, many of them are 18, 19, 20, very similar to age to some of the young people that are still in our church. And yet in a very different stage of life, because they've left home, they've come to a new place at probably the most challenging time in history in recent years. And so I'm really here to learn as well, but to kind of share a bit about what we as a church have been learning. What does it mean for us to be a church that's really good news for students, those that are journeying in their faith and are looking for a home to help them journey in their Christian walk, and for those students that have arrived in Preston and are suddenly prepared to ask the big questions and to give church a go. And the interesting thing for us is that because until a couple of weeks ago with the second lockdown, because we were one of the only churches in Preston that were doing in-person services again, and everything else was shut, we've seen a lot of new students come and connect with us because there isn't much else to do, which is really, really interesting. So we're, as a church, really scratching our heads as to how we can stay in contact in really meaningful ways with students that feel quite profoundly isolated. But interestingly, when I say to them, do you want to go home? They're like, no, this is my uni experience. So it's a really interesting, all the assumptions of how I think they might be feeling. I've just got to let all of that drop and just become a church that's very good at listening to these students in our context and what it is that we can do to serve and support and cheer them on. So that's me.
Yeah, I love that. And it is such a transitional moment in life, isn't it? I mean, I was a student for 8 years in the end. I think my parents must have despaired, but I do remember just that time shaped me so much. It was such an amazing time, full of potential and possibility, but it is a massive change. And like you say, I'm so aware. I run a project called Headstrong, which is aiming also, like you, Rachel, at the sort of teenage years. But I'm aware that we suddenly have thrust those same the older teenagers suddenly into this world where not only are they making that big step into independent life for the first time and all the excitements that carries, but they're doing it in the middle of this crazy moment when things are so unexpected, so uncertain, they're constantly changing. And we are expecting them to adapt and respond incredibly well to a lot that's unexpected. But also they are hearing an awful lot of negativity that's being spoken about them. As you've said, Rachel, assumptions being made about what they are and aren't doing. I wonder if you guys could both just share a little bit of your context, like what is going on for students in your area. And I know that things are different in different parts of the UK, in Wales, in Scotland. You know, in the UK, as we're recording right now, we are under a second lockdown. That's different in some of those other countries and spaces. But tell me what's going on and what are your key concerns or the things that you're aware of when it comes to student wellbeing right now? Roger, we'll start with you.
I mean, that's great, because I would very much resonate with what you've said already. So the way things are working at Lincoln at the moment as a university, so we're a university of about 16,000 students. We have about 1,200 psychology students in my school, so they're the people I usually have contact with most. We're sort of 25% face-to-face and 75% online. So a lot of stuff that used to be face-to-face lectures is now all on various social media in various different ways of communicating. But I really resonate with what you were both saying, really. So my day to work now is Monday. So I go onto campus on a Monday to meet with students, deliver stuff face to face. Some lectures that used to be 1 hour are now 4 hours, because with social distancing, even our biggest lecture theatres can only now contain 70 people. So sometimes you're kind of speaking all in a row, and then you're sort of meeting people individually, rooms, wearing a visor, stinking of alcohol because of the hand sanitizer, not for any fun reason. Lots of sort of detours around campus and one-way systems and all those kind of things. And it's hugely demanding, you know, so all of that is very stressful. It's quite inconvenient. There's a sort of general sense of threat. A lot of the admin staff and service personnel that I always used to be picking up the phone to and saying, I've got no clue what I'm doing, they're not in their offices anymore, so it's just a bit more difficult to get hold of them and things like that. But having said all that, I'm really, really impressed with everybody in the situation. So I literally came home and collapsed in a chair on Monday night and just said to Marie Claire, my other half, I was just saying, you know, it's really tough. And I just let out this huge, big groan. But man, the students are doing so well. I'm so admiring of how they've adapted, of how they're engaging, what kind of resilience they've shown, the kind of questions they're coming up with. And then I look at the staff as well on every level, certainly in my experience. So, you know, we're having to adapt on a day-to-day basis, all kinds of demands coming through. So it's got that kind of really strange thing. On the one hand, I carry a lot of sadness for the current first years, particularly because they're sort of missing out on some of the atmosphere that usually accompanies Freshers Week and your first semester on campus. But on the other hand, loads of admiration for them as well, in terms of, man, this is not Generation Snowflake at all. They are not complaining. They are absolutely getting on with it. And yeah, I you know, hats off to them.
Oh, I'm so glad that you said that, because I think at the moment I feel like a little bit of like a protective bear that roars really loudly whenever I hear things in national media or comments from people from older generation. I include myself in the old generation, who sort of kind of paint this picture. Well, they're all having COVID parties, aren't they? And they're all doing this, they're all doing. And I think our experience is very similar here. So obviously, Roger, you know the inside of university life way more than I do. So I'm now definitely an outsider looking into UCLan, an extraordinary university that's worked so hard these last 10 years to become a real leader in their field. We're about 35,000 students. Interestingly for UCLan, a large percentage, I'm not going to put a figure on it, but a large percentage live at home in the sort of localish area and come in for lectures. So as a university, not much happens in the evening for everybody. It's kind of suddenly socially very sliced up. But we have a lot of international students, and that's a real cause for concern for us, because obviously during the first lockdown, many of them couldn't go home to other countries, and we were realizing a little bit of a humanitarian crisis unfolding that the university responded to, and we were able to support them in that. But also we have a lot of students that will come and do an initial year before they do their degree, and I think they're the students that I feel as a church we're in a way most called to, because these are the 18-year-olds that are working out whether university is for them, and they're doing a year's course, and often they come a very long way from other country to Preston, where it's raining quite a lot. And if you come from the south and you come to Preston and it's grey, and then many of them are in flats of 5 or 6 students, but they might be the only one that's made it into the halls of residence. So they're on their own in a flat, and they're only allowed to socialise outside of their halls with that flat, but there's nobody else in the flat. They're on their own. A little bit like your uni, part in-person lectures, part online. But I think what I find in the conversations I have, we have about 35 students that are connected with us at the moment, so not huge numbers at all at the Minster, is they're so focused on their studies. They're so focused on what it is that's brought them to uni. So although I'm thinking I want to have chats with you about lockdown and COVID and pandemics and vaccines, they've spent the day really in art history or Japanese or computer design, and they really want to talk about that and the difference that knowing Jesus makes if you're pursuing a career in the arts. And I think, again, we need to make sure that we don't make the most important thing the thing that isn't maybe their most important thing. Like this, the lockdown and the support is so essential, but sometimes I've noticed the students just want to have a little chat about, you know, they've just broken up with their boyfriend online, or, you know, the one flatmate they have is eating the beans out of the cupboard. So I think it's a really interesting space to be in, because we want to be available for those big conversations, all the big conversations really. So yes, there's some of our that we have noticed. I mean, I live opposite A&E here at Preston, and the number of times over the year that I've been texted at 3 a.m. from a student that ends up in A&E, and I pad over my slippers and a cup of tea. But we're sort of noticing that there are students who are really struggling with this, and we've noticed a little bit of an increase. I'm not again going to put any figures or stats. I don't know if that's the same across the nation, but there is some concern for us around young people, students that are very isolated and struggling to reach out for help, really.
Yeah, and I'm aware, as you say that in my head there's sort of I don't want to talk about two groups, because mental and emotional health isn't like that, but there are specific concerns for students and young people who do have particularly clinical mental health challenges, who perhaps have pre-existing issues around anxiety, depression, for whom this is therefore particularly challenging. But there's also just the pressure. I mean, this season has been unique in that it's pushed us all into a space where mental and emotional health becomes something we cannot take for granted. Yeah. And so many of the things that I'm talking about in all of the various spaces that I'm in right now, I'm sharing things that I'm putting into place for my own family, my own teenager, myself, just to stay well, to sustain good well-being. So perhaps if we talk in a minute about students who do have specific mental health problems, who are more at the illness end of that scale now, but in general, are there key concerns that you guys have for that more overall student well-being? Are there particular groups of students you're concerned about, or particular contexts, or things that you're seeing that are really unhelpful or placing extra pressure?
Yeah, so I mean, if I kick off on that, Rachel, so so my kind of feeling really is that what we're seeing is, firstly, I mentioned this, that it's very demanding now, because you're online, you're around campus, all these kind of strange things going on. And my view would be that basically what it means is that stress levels have risen in students. So it's that sense of that things are very, very difficult. And what that means, if people have pre-existing mental health problems, they're likely to sort of trigger them and they become worse. But then also people who, and this happens to students in transition, quite often transitioning into university in and of itself is really stressful and difficult. And for some students, it's the first time they've ever experienced a mental health problem that requires professional help in some way. So I guess what I'm seeing a lot of is it's students trying to decide really which bits of this can I control and which bits of this do I just have to accept, and not quite knowing which is which really. I mean, we might talk about isolation as well in a moment, but I guess when I'm starting to look at some of the research that's currently been done on who does well in this situation, as much as we can talk about well at the moment, but the people who seem to cope best are the people who have the greatest psychological flexibility. That there's certain aspects about this. It's just a pandemic. We can do nothing about it. There's loads of it that's completely out of our control. And therefore it's normal to be a bit scared, to be apprehensive, to be worried about it. If you've had a financial hit, it's perfectly normal to be bothered by that. There's certain losses in terms of relationships and things like that that will leave us a bit down. So all of that is completely normal. And my view would be that some of that just has to be accepted as a normal human response to a difficult situation. But then the other piece is that sometimes what happens, because it feels so big, there's that other side of things where there are things we can do. There are psychological skills we can develop. There are connections we can make. You know, we've all discovered the world of Zoom and being online and things like that. And we need to use that as much as we can to increase our connectedness. And so I feel like that I almost keep saying to students, it's like the old serenity prayer, isn't it? God, give me the courage to change what I can change, the patience to accept what I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I feel like that's the dilemma that a lot of students and we ourselves find ourselves in right now.
Yeah. Now you mentioned isolation. So let's pick up on that just for a second, and I feel a personal link to this subject, because we are in our second consecutive 14 days of isolation, because child number 2 had to isolate for 14 days, and then literally within 48 hours child number 1 got the phone call. So we don't as parents have to isolate, but as a household we've been in that space. So I feel I know it better now than I did a few weeks ago. But this is impacting students in particular because of the context of their living environment, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
I think as well, if the kind of the messaging in churches, if we talk about churches and Christian students now for a little bit, because the messaging in churches has been, when you get to uni, make sure you find a local church, because this is a great place to put down your roots, to kind of feel some kind of established space that you can then have the confidence to go out and make friends, meet different people, engage in bigger debates, learn more about the world. If actually you've got this church family that will help sort of bolster you. And so we have all these Christian students, or those that are just like would see church as an empathetic, good place for them to be. That is just cut off for them, isn't it? And I think that's a real tragedy as well, is that, I mean, students are the most extraordinary gift to a local church, not because they jump on volunteer rotas, not because of that, but because the stage of life they're at, they're bold in asking the big questions about faith. And they're also deeply playful with their theology. They're deeply playful with their, let's try this out, let's take some risks, let's bring the real stuff to Jesus. I mean, nothing changes a worship group like having a service, like having a bunch of under 25s in there, because they are bringing to Jesus what's really going on for them, and you have to up your game as those that pastor them. So I think there's that, I feel that great sadness is that's added to the isolation. So we have students that have come to uni and they wanted the Freshers Week and they wanted the good friendships, and that's really difficult for them, although they're still forming these friendships. But imagine those students that came to uni expecting, well, at home, I have a church family. I have lots of adults and children and people of all walks of life that I can access. So now not only have I not got my peer group at uni, I've also not got that other thing that's so big in my life. I can jump online, but then I'm online all the time with everything else. So before lockdown happened, and it was a little bit naughty, so please nobody pull me up on this one, but it was before lockdown when we were allowed to meet in groups of 6. And we had some of our little kids knocking around after the service. We'd shut the main doors. We were feeding the students pizza, socially distanced, the rest of it. And I said, shall we play a massive game of hide and seek? And it was the most, like, suddenly we had 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 50-year-olds, and we played this massive game and we all had so much fun. And something in me went, oh God, yeah, the thing that we don't do in flipping COVID season is play. We don't do stupid stuff together like this because we have to be so measured. And I agree with you, Roger, that I think students have been leading the way in being utterly mindful of the environment. I've never had to say to a student, sanitize your hands, put your mask on. Adults, I have to regularly say, put your mask on. Older adults. So I think they really get it, that this is a world where they have to operate reserved.
Yeah.
And I just think the tragedy is when can they unleash without it being on the 9 o'clock news? Manchester students having a COVID party. It's like, God, come on, So I think the playfulness, adds to the isolation that you were talking about, Kate.
Yeah, so it's the obvious isolation if you've become. I mean, for some students, literally will have had seasons where they've not been able to leave a room or a student flat or something. But as you say, Rachel, so much what we've lost is just the colour and the pattern of everyday life, the spontaneous moments, the friendships that may not be your utterly best mates, but you would have a laugh with, someone you might see in church and you wouldn't see anywhere else, who you won't see right now. Roger, I am aware of concerns, particularly for students who are in spaces, and maybe there'll be some people who will watch this who are right now having to isolate. They're not allowed to leave their accommodation. And I spoke to a young person who was in that position recently, who was saying to me, like, oh, I just need to get a grip. I'm being ridiculous. It's just 2 weeks, and I'm just really frustrated with myself. And I was saying to them, no, mate, this is really hard psychologically to not be able to leave a room. And to not have, like, we in our house isolating at the same time, we have stuff we can do. We can move from room to room. My teenager has stuff she can do. It is hard, isn't it? Let's say, name it how it is.
Yeah. So psychologically, when you're isolated like that, I mean, effectively, it's like a sensory deprivation experiment. Really. So you kind of, if you spend any period of time where for the entire 24-hour period, you're not going to see anybody else, maybe apart from on a screen, then quite often we suffer what some psychologists will call psychic entropy, which is basically a lot of the categories you use to organize your identity and your life and your sense of purpose just all start falling to pieces. I mean, it happens to me most days about 3 p.m. in the afternoon, but I mean, that's a very mild version of it. And I think that the thing I've been stressing to students is that belongingness is it's always been one of the most important things to keep students in university, to make university a worthwhile experience. And that's what the kind of current restrictions are a real sort of threat to, really. So I guess what I've been emphasizing, and all my colleagues and the entire campus really, is just maximizing as many points of connection as they can possibly have. So there's some of that, if people are struggling with mental health issues or other disabilities or things like that, some of that will be health related. So you've got to be registered with a GP. It would be good if your student wellbeing team actually know who you are. Even if you never see them, you just know that they're there. Then there's kind of all kinds of educational ways of connecting. So actually, if the university is still meeting face-to-face, going to those tutor groups, going to your lectures. The way the School of Psychology in Lincoln is currently working, we're organising quizzes and all kinds of things online to keep things moving. We've got peer mentors who are third-year students who look after first years. So doing all these kind of things just to try and maximise the sense of community and belongingness. And then also even some of the social groups. So I know, the football team might not be meeting this year, sadly. But you know what? The Harry Potter Club probably is still meeting online. So, wherever you're connected, just make sure that you make as many good connections. And I think church, for many students, particularly if they've come with faith to university, may actually be one of the principal places of connection and belongingness. And it could actually be the main thing that sort of carries them through.
Yeah, and we will definitely chat more about how churches can do that effectively in a minute. I just want to pick up, if I can, on a couple of things you've mentioned there, because I know they're questions that a lot of students have and parents have and other things. You talked about some specifics there about where can students go if they're struggling. So that feels really important to me. Let's just give some clarity on that. So you talked about GP. Which is that? The GP in their student town or their home GP? And student wellbeing. I know obviously you're talking about Lincoln. Rachel will no doubt know a little bit about Preston. But where's the best places for students to go if they are struggling?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really, really big question, and it's hugely diverse across the country as well. So kind of different universities have different things going on. So the first thing I would say is if you are a student and you're intending to stay at university, so I would say, at the beginning, when you go with the intention of staying, I would argue that every student should register with a GP, particularly if you know you've got ongoing conditions or pre-existing conditions. Absolutely essential for you to be registered at university with a local health service. Many universities that will be on campus, so it's not a hard thing. They're friendly, they're working with students. My experience is, I worked as senior tutor for the School of Psychology, so I was pastorally responsible for all 1,000 odd of our students during that period of time. And I could almost guarantee that if a student was struggling and they hadn't registered with their GP, it was almost a sign they probably weren't going to make it to the end of the year, if not the end of the semester. So it's just very, very simple, practical thing to do. Then on top of that, if there is a student wellbeing service there, usually they have drop-in centres, or they have ways of making contact with them that are really simple. And again, don't be scared of those people. They're friendly, they're used to working with students, they're designed to be there. And I mean, if other places are doing similar to what Lincoln is doing, obviously all that kind of stuff has gone online. But when I'm supervising the student wellbeing team now, they're saying, well, to begin with, we really resisted that. We thought it wouldn't be the same. But actually now we're discovering in some ways we're supporting students better than we ever have done. So all the proactive stuff we used to do about managing stress and dealing with depression and being scared of your exams and all those kind of things, we're doing all of that stuff online. More people are showing up, more people are engaging with it. International students, suddenly, some of them are still studying in Italy or Japan or wherever, and we can still be online to those people as well, making sure they're still engaged. So actually, for me, those are the kind of two ideal side of things. Your GP, because that's your kind of gatekeeper into the NHS, and then your student wellbeing service, whatever that looks like, should have links into pretty much every agency in the city. So in itself, it should be connected to all kinds of other places. So they're live things. We could talk about online stuff. Do you want to talk about that, or should we leave that for a moment?
Throw one thing into that, because I would absolutely agree, and we at UCLan have a great student support centre. You can just turn up and you can meet somebody face to face, and they will then take information and get somebody for you. The other thing is, I think Fusion Student Link Up will tell churches in your area that are geared up for students. And one of the things that we've noticed at Preston Minster is that a couple of times we've been able to help advocate for a student who's struggling to access the great services at university for a variety of reasons, but we've just helped to come alongside and say, oh, well, yeah, we could walk, socially distance, we could walk together there, or we could have a look online with you and have a little look and see, because sometimes it's still written in a way that is quite challenging to get your head around. I'm not quite sure what I need, particularly for students that feel there's a number of students I think will feel core universities have got so much pressure on. There must be people that are worse off than me, and actually having somebody in church saying, no, come on, that's what they're here for, and we've been here as a church for many years, we know how good these services are at the university. So it's a good challenge for churches to find out a bit more what universities are actually offering as well, isn't it? Not assuming that because the students say, I don't know, that there isn't anything. So it's good for us to do our part.
And that's such a good point for churches as well, isn't it? I think that we can be involved in supporting the amazing work that groups like some of those that Roger has talked about are doing by helping people to connect with it and helping to break down some of the fears and misconceptions that people have about what might happen when I contact them. And just, as you say, the really practical things, helping someone think, when are you going to phone them? Let's help you find the phone number. Let's talk through what you're going to say. And some of that stuff is so important, particularly for students who might find themselves away from home, away from their usual support. And also I'm aware as a psychologist that developmentally, they are in a season that is about developing independence. So their drive to do things on their own is rightly really strong. and so not to fall back on phoning mum or dad. And there's a lot of struggle for students around that, and universities can have this amazing space therefore where they can help them to do that. And let's just pause a little bit on the whole question around churches, Rachel, because I love that you've talked about some of the positive things they can do. I'm aware that obviously not all students have that faith. So can you share some tips, some thoughts from your experience supporting the whole student body? I know you've mentioned international students, which is one group, students of no faith, students of a different faith, students with Christian faith. What are your sort of top tips for how churches can do that really effectively and support them well?
Well, I think so. Just to speak to churches now, I think as churches, we need to communicate really clearly that we love the institution of universities. We love the community. We don't see them as a pool from which to fish students from. We see it as this really diverse. It's like having a small town in a town, isn't it, in a city? And so we really pray a lot for our university. We do a lot of prayer walking, very sensitively, just walking around, eyes on, asking Christian lecturers, what are some of the issues that are going on? How can we be praying and responding? So just having an open heart to university. Students listening to this who maybe are not from the Christian community, or you think, actually, I would go to stuff as long as I wasn't pounced upon. I think churches that are geared up for students actually really love walking alongside students and just being a safe place where students can explore the big issues. And if you walk into a church or check out something online and think, no, that's not for me, that's absolutely fine. And it's a good chance at university to try maybe different expressions of Christianity, different churches. But one of the things at Preston Minster is that, so during lockdown, we began to learn through chatting with our lovely friends who run Preston Promise, a grassroots Muslim community group, that there were a number of students, they would feed the Muslim students during Ramadan who were fasting, they'd feed them in the evening, and realised that lots of international students were registering to have that meal, not because they were fasting, but because they were hungry and hadn't yet worked out what services they could access, all the rest of it, and were falling through the gaps. And so we as a church joined a number of other faith groups who on a rota were cooking hot dinners for 300, 400 students. And we got lots of students helping us to cook these meals and helping us to learn what would be the kinds of foods that would be really brilliant for students from South Asia, who seem to be the group that largely needed these meals. So it was this really interesting experience for us, the church, where we were learning not to heroically do the wrong thing, but we were learning to listen to what the actual need was and play our part alongside lots of other great community of faith and no faith groups, with students as the key drivers. They were mainly cooking the meals, they were telling us what was needed, they were getting the word out to their friends, they were ensuring social distancing. And it was a powerful way, I think, for us as a church to say, students are in a different life stage to your youth group. There's lots of overlap around issues, there's lots of overlap around what might be going on, but to actually experience students differently and to then respond to them differently, because actually what they are experiencing is different. So that's one thing. And I guess at the Minster, we do lots of things like Alpha Cinema. Lots of what we do is geared up to say, just come and hang out with us and ask big questions and bring your story and bring your experience. And I think that's felt like Kate, a really, really positive way to be doing the mission of the church in a way that's profoundly real and is recognizing that students are looking for a deep connection. I think it's about being honest, isn't it? We're not going to feed you so therefore we can then preach to you. And the great thing about Alpha is it's not preaching, it's not pushy, and there's great food. So I think finding some of these projects where students just know they can trust you because it's really clear what's on offer, I think it's really important. The one last thing I wanted to say about the isolation bit is we've noticed that students have been very good at working out who needs, in their peer group, needs help, but can often feel that it can often develop quite codependent relationships. So I think one of the things we can do as church is really help students to be friends for the long haul. My line at the moment with students quite a bit is, it'd be amazing if you guys could be friends for the long haul. And actually, if right now you see yourself as this person's saviour, you're going to burn out and you might not hang out with them in a week's time because it's just too intense. So just really helping students to also be good advocates of each other in accessing services, not feeling they have to do it for each other as well. So I think churches we can help sort of pay attention a bit to the deeply pastoral students who would take on themselves quite a lot of the welfare issues of people that they don't really know very well yet.
So it feels like there's three main points coming out there. People who are listening who are from churches, and number one is don't make assumptions, don't assume that what you've heard, but do ask around, find out what the situation is in your local area, and then create points of connection and safe spaces where students can belong. I love what you're talking about, that sense of belonging, and I love what you said about, students, we miss you too. This isn't just, I think so much of what we hear can be about students as this nuisance group, this negative generation. And I love them too. So I love that sense of actually churches miss you guys. So when you connect with us as churches, as church leaders, we love it. We benefit too. It's not just us being amazing for you. It's like, actually, it really makes our day as well. But then also using local services. And I love the link therefore between Roger bringing the perspective from universities and what you're sharing about churches, Rachel, because connecting those things, and mental health services too, who we don't have anyone specifically representing them, but I know do amazing work in really difficult circumstances. And they often get a bad press. And so I think where we can help people engage with them and help them do the amazing stuff they do even better, that's brilliant. But I'm interested in what you've brought up, Rachel, and it feels like let's just pause on that for students who are hitting crisis. And we talked before about students who have got some really, perhaps cross the line is something that we might see as clinical illness. They're really struggling. Love what you're talking about, students supporting students, trying to look after each other as well as they can. Let's think about, are there specific things that you guys would want to say about that for students who might be struggling themselves, for if they're concerned about someone else? How do you know in a season when everybody is struggling, the people who actually really do need help?
Yeah. It's difficult to work out when that line is crossed, isn't it? And that's part of the issue as well. And I think the first thing to say is you're looking out for signs that someone might harm themselves or someone else. So that's the extreme level of risk, if you like, where this person's starting to talk about doing something nasty to either themselves or somebody else, and that's the kind of sign of they definitely need help. I think quite often we might notice that in other people before they notice it in themselves. And I think let's all be aware that all of us, no matter how much expertise you've got, sooner or later you need to ask somebody else for help. So I totally agree with Rachel's sort of idea of don't get into a sort of very idealized one-to-one lockup where you've suddenly become the savior of this person. Everybody else let them down, but you're going to be the one who heals them, and then sooner or later your body is lying in the ditch alongside all the others that they've burnt out along the path. So really slip out of those kind of idealizations. And then I think the other side of it is that clinical psychologists are always asking this question: how do we know when someone crosses that kind of line for clinical diagnosis? How do we decide that? Lots of different answers, but ultimately the answer seems to be at the point where either you or someone else decides that you can't cope with it on your own, that you actually need some extra special help. And if I'm honest, all of us find ourselves there at some point. So I think it's when, your connectedness, the different things that are in place aren't quite doing enough, you still feel like there's something more, that's the point at which to seek help and go forward. So it's kind of looking at risk and thinking about, can you manage this with the resources you currently have?
And one thing that I'm hearing discussed and debated is the question around, is there a point at which students should not persist in trying to complete this year at uni? It's a tricky conversation, but we know that dropout rates are rising. Some students have just gone home. Now this is a huge area because it's very complex in terms of the experience that they're having and where the whole COVID pandemic situation is going, if only we knew that. But are there situations where you might say to someone, think about that? And what's the best thing for students to do if that's the space they're in, if they're thinking, to be honest, I'm going to jack this all in, I've had it. We've just heard this morning that students are, we hope and pray, going to get home for Christmas, but there will be a lot of students who, when they've got home, just think, actually, do I go back? What are your thoughts, both of you, on that?
I think, Roger, I'm going to defer to you in terms of just what that would mean in terms of uni and less fit. I think the one thought to chuck in here is your colleague, Kate, Dr. Will Vanderhaal. Is he doctor? Anyway, never mind. Will Vanderhaal.
We're flashing around the titles today. Yeah.
Talks about how shame is the fear of unbelonging. And I think students who I talk to feel that they're at the bottom of everyone's priority list, and I don't say that in an entitlement kind of thing. It's just a genuine, they're almost a touchstone for this national disappointment with 2020 and this heaviness. And I think it's very difficult for students to, I'm seeing with the few that I'm supporting here, that they struggle to genuinely own the decision, because it's almost impossible to think, what do I want to do? Because they're conscious of how their family's been coping. They've been shacked up with them, like those of the year, like those that have just started at uni this year. So, and they don't particularly want to go home. So there's the option of staying with the course that I'm struggling with because of all this stuff, or just the social stuff, going home and having to live with seeing my parents' disappointment or whatever our situation was, feeling a little bit of the judgment of the nation on them. And I part of me wants to say to these students, because I'm not their lecturer, part of me wants to say, just day by day, just see, make it till Christmas. Don't make any big decisions, partly because I know that I'm horrendous at making decisions most of the time, let alone big ones against a pandemic, when everything suddenly shifts all the time. And I think maybe in that, what role that people like myself and churches and other support groups can do is help to understand, how do you handle disappointment? And then how do you hear good news, like a potential vaccine on the horizon? What's that information supposed to make me think now? Like, there's so many shoulds and coulds. And I think how we can help wonderful students listening think, actually today, what is it today that feels doable? What 1 degree change could make today more doable? I'm not sure we'll have answered that question, Kate, particularly helpful with your course, but I'm just thinking the shame element to this is so loud, and we've got to talk about that as well as
don't feel like you have to make those decisions on your own. And again, I love the idea that churches can support and create some spaces where students can have those conversations. Roger, from your perspective in sort of as establishment university staff,
speaking for the institutions of higher education in the UK,
of the entire country,
No, I really agree with Rachel in the sense that I think we do have to take the pressure off of that decision. So I think both politically and as universities, I mean, our heart is always to hold people in and keep them apart. But I think the idea of deferring or leaving always has to be an option on the table. I've got students who've come back this year after deferring last year, and weirdly, they're doing quite well this year in a way that they couldn't have done when things were quite normal business as usual last year. So students are always thinking around these kind of issues, and I guess I have these conversations quite often with my personal tutees at university, where you're thinking, do you need an essay extension, or do you need extenuating circumstances, or do you need to cut this year and go home and come back? And so I guess firstly, I would say the fact that the government have now said that between the 3rd and the 9th of December, students will be going home, I think that helps. So I think firstly, that's taken the pressure off, because I think a lot of people feared that at the moment their family tucked into Christmas dinner, they'd be locked in a flat somewhere eating a pot noodle, So it looked like some people were really fearing they'd be stuck. And that fear has been removed slightly, not quite so much for international students, but certainly for students living away from home in the UK. And then I guess if I were to go with what I'm observing on campus, it is that I would say that so some students, and I'm talking first years particularly, seem to be making the decision to go home at the point when they realise that, say, the rest of the bubble of their apartment has already decided to go home. So they're going, well, if all other 6 have gone home, I'm not sticking around here on my own, I'm off too. And I completely understand that kind of thing. The other thing is that universities, a lot of those students are basically then going, oh, I'm self-isolating. And automatically, most universities are then putting all their stuff online anyway. So you can still stay in university and go home. So a lot of our students are doing that. It's not necessarily how we'd like it to be. We'd like them to be on campus and see them face to face, but it's still possible to carry on from home if you do it in that way.
So again, have conversations, it sounds like. Don't feel, and it feels like you're advising don't be too all or nothing. There's quite a lot of grey in the middle between either you carry on or you quit. There's lots of ways that you could manage this.
There's a lot in the middle, but then there's also students that I was meeting with a student online yesterday, and she's living entirely on her own at university, single person flat, seems perfectly happy. She's getting on fine. And so it's like it's not one rule for everybody. You've got to decide what can and can't cope with. That's the way to think about it.
And we haven't mentioned the P word, which is parents. But I'm aware that many parents might be watching. So I am a parent. I have a teenager. She's not a student yet. But I am aware of the challenge for parents who are trying to hold the balance well between supporting their young people, not wanting to hover and do the helicopter parent thing, but also probably really, if they're honest, wanting to get in the car, drive there, pick them up and bring them home where it's safe. And I'm really interested in your thoughts and advice for parents before we finish.
Oof, gosh. Also, as a parent, I just think, who am I to give any other parents advice? Because I'm the parent of the students that are part of Preston Minster, and I feel quite parental towards them. So if I actually was their parent, I think I'd be like you, Kate. I'd be sleeping bag on the floor, making sure they're not alone. I think this is a wonderful opportunity, isn't it, to use that adult to adult voice that is the kind of leveling with you, that makes it very clear to our children. And this is good for 13-year-old pluses, not just for students. Actually, you're treating them as somebody who has the ability to make decisions, and there might be wisdom you want to bring into that, and practical logistics like you'd have to get the train if you're coming at that date, or I could pick you up. But let's make sure that it's not, well, you'll have to get the train then, or I'll pick you up. I think actually they're just making sure that our children know that they can make these decisions, and there isn't, let's not add any more emotional weaponizing to this stuff. Also, can I say to churches, if you're watching this and you have students that come back, and let's say we all get the vaccine and we can all open services at Christmas or whatever.
I'm liking that.
I love it. But let's be really careful what questions we ask students, because questions can sound loaded. So you're sticking it out, are you? Or you're still around? Or so I just think, say, I would love to hear how this term has been for you. Is a much better question than, so you can go in January then. Oh, your mum's so worried about you. So I just think, let's just be really, actually I spend a lot of time with students, but I don't really know what it's like to actually be in a flat, probably the width of my bookshelf, walking around my walk once a day on a campus where there is nobody. I don't know what that's like. So let's ask these lovely students who come back at Christmas, what has that been like for you? And what can I be doing? What could we do next term to just let you know you're loved and you're not alone? So yeah, that's my...
And as a parent, I always say to other parents that the sentence that you'll use most once your kids become adolescents and students is, how can I help you to manage this? So not taking control, even though every part of you wants to, but trying to help them to make good decisions and enabling them as much as you can. Any other thoughts from you, Roger, on this?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with everything you've said. I think it's brilliant. And I mean, the main thing I would say is this transition to university has always been difficult for parents. I mean, it just is. And for students, and it's hard for parents. And we've talked a little bit about the phase of life that they're in, which is various emerging adulthood or the adulting or whatever, which basically means you're being asked to behave like an adult, but you kind of still feel a little bit like a child. And so I think exactly the approach you're describing, Kate, is right, that both of you are talking about, really, which is, in a sense, you become a consultant to your child now. So you become their coach, and if they come to you with a problem, in the first instance, you'd be coaching them and help them to think about how they could solve it, which phone calls they need to make. Some of those kind of being the responsible adult. I think some of, Rachel, you've talked about a bit about this in church, so sometimes they don't know how to email their health service or whatever, and so I'll help them draft it, and we'll talk about how do you do that. But in the end, they send it, they take responsibility for it, that side of things. And then I think, of course, there are times when we're really worried about our kids and we do feel we need to jump in. I think that should be our sort of last resort, to get heroic and jump in. But most universities, particularly on the mental health side of things, will have various schemes. So the far end of things is the next of kin, which means if something goes really horribly wrong, as a parent, you'll probably find out about it. But then most universities will have issues of parental consent or even significant other consent, where your child can basically sign so that various services are allowed to inform you about what's going on if there's something like that going on. So that can be there.
And is that a conversation a parent or a student would have, what, with student wellbeing?
Yes, yeah. So for us, it's with student wellbeing or student support services, it's sometimes called, if that's a concern. But you have to remember that once your child goes to university, they are your principal source of information about what's going on. So if they don't sign that form, you don't get a look in it. So that's part of the issue. And then the other thing I would say, if you do leap in as a parent, I would say keep in mind that sometimes your child's perspective on what is going on is really different from yours quite often. So I mean, I probably heard maybe 3 or 4 stories last week where parents had phoned up various parts of the university saying, my child's suicidal, they're having an absolute terrible time. And then when we check in with them, they're not that bothered, or they don't want to admit to it, or they don't want your help, or in one occasion they were apologizing for their mum and saying, I'm so sorry she spoke to you like that. So I think as parents, even if we kind of then get involved, we have to then really be really savvy and sensitive about, this is now a system that you're dealing with that doesn't necessarily know how to respond really easily to what parents need from us.
And there is an appropriate balance of respecting the independence and the individuality of students who have now become, they are adults in their own right. And I love the description of yourself as a parent as a consultant to your child, and the awareness there are other consultants. There are amazing people like Rachel, like some of the people in churches across the country, the whole of the UK, who are other sources of support. And I, with my teenagers, not yet students, but also for anyone who's parenting, I would say encourage your young people to make those connections, because it really does take a village to raise a child or a teenager or a student, or just to be an adult. Your description of feeling sometimes like an adult and occasionally like a child, well, I'm in my 40s and I still have moments like that too. So we all need that, don't we? We need many consultants, friends, family, different support at different levels. I'm gonna draw us to a close just of time, but I am going to give you time to share some final thoughts in a minute so you can ponder what they are. Roger, though, you mentioned some other sources of support, some online links and things. Are there particular things that would be useful for people to know about that we can share?
Do you want to say something about Shout, quick, Kate, because you raised that?
Yeah, well, so actually you might want to give the URL, because I'm not totally sure what it is, but Shout is an amazing tech support service, isn't it? We can share the links in the forums where we share this recording so that people can get in touch. But you can text. It's a crisis support service where you can text and someone will reply to you in the moment.
Yeah, that's great. Other ones so a lot of universities to subscribe to Together All, used to be called Big White Wall, which is basically an online website. So it's Together All one word, Together All. And basically experts on there, places to share if you're kind of concerned or you're dealing with whether it's stress, anxiety, depression, whatever. You can go on there. There's information, there's courses, do all kinds of things there. The other app that I've sort of been working on with some people is called Fika, and you can download that from wherever you download your apps. Just download Fika, Fika, and it's an emotional fitness app. So I was just doing a broadcast with them yesterday when we're recording this, where we were talking about different ways of managing stress, but they have all kinds of great stuff there about connecting with people, building your confidence, being assertive, all these kind of programs that they do. And you can download that for free. Many of the universities in the country now actually have a contract with Fika. And they're really working on kind of the ethos that I've been talking about, which is really about how do you strengthen students and get them emotionally fit so that they're beginning to build the skills they need to cope with a situation like this. It's a lovely, lovely resource there.
And are there any final thoughts that you just want to share? And then I will come to you, Rachel, don't worry.
So I think final thoughts, I'm thinking towards Christmas. Christmas is that time, isn't it, where we think about hope arriving in the most fragile form possible as a baby. And I feel like that is how we all feel at the moment. And I guess if I were going to speak from the psychology of hope, The psychology of hope basically says that when we hope, we believe there is going to be a better future. We believe that we have to contribute something to bringing that future about. There's loads of ways to get there, so we can be really creative, but all of them will involve some hard work, some frustrations, some difficulty, some struggle. And I think let's just keep that in mind, that being hopeful about the season that's coming isn't just about, oh yeah, it's all going to be fine. It's about, let's all be together, let's work together, and let's try and make the best of what we can do. So when I think about Christmas coming, I think it might be a smaller Christmas than we used to. We might be with fewer people, but let's use that time to really connect deeply with a smaller number of people. And I almost view it as a time of rest and hibernation, where you huddle together with a smaller group, and use it as a time of replenishment.
Yeah. Rachel, final thoughts from you, or anything that you need to share?
Monica from Friends jumping in all the time. I was going to say that fika is a Norwegian word for the break that you have, where you have coffee and bread and cheese. It's a really nice kind of like social glue. I like it, they've chosen that word. And I love your hygge idea of snuggling. No, I think this is just very helpful. I think very practical things like too, like, is there a local coffee shop in the town or the city where your uni is that has got a little community thing going on? And even if you just go there like once every couple of days, if your student allowance allows it, just find little points of community. We found some really interesting things happening in Preston. People just like sitting in certain parks, you know, going for social distance walks. So find your little hole, you know, your little areas where you can feel community as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I love that what you both shared, that thing of this hope doesn't have to be passive. This is difficult, and there are challenges of this season, but there are things that we can do to help ourselves, to help other people, and most of all, to pull together and support one another in this, which is really powerful. Thank you guys both so much. You know, I'm aware that, as I say, we'll have lots of people watching from all kinds of different contexts. Rachel, I wonder if you would just draw us to a close just by praying for all of the things that we've talked about, for all the people who are sharing this moment with us.
The Bible is full of stories of people meeting God in the most extraordinary ways. And God met Gideon as he was hiding in a wine press, or maybe in his university hall room. And God rocked up and said, "Hi there, superstar." And Gideon said, "What? Do you know what's going on for me?" And in Judges 6:14, it said this: God turned to Gideon and smiled at him and said, "Go in the strength that you have." So we bless you, whoever you are, whatever point you are on the journey of being a student and a journey of faith. May you know in this season that there is strength for you, that God can put strength deep within you. Go in the strength that you have. You are not alone. Amen.
Amen. Thank you both so much. So grateful for your wisdom and thoughts in this moment. We will share some of the links, some of the things that we've talked about, wherever you're watching this. If you look at the chat or the space, have a look for links, because we will make sure that they are shared wherever this video is shared. But wherever you are, whatever your experience is, like Rachel says, we just speak blessing over you and pray the best of this season, like Roger says, and we just think of a better future. This is not the end of any of our stories. There is good stuff ahead.